What if I told you that the most baffling case of my entire career didn't happen during my 35 years on the force, but 3 years into my retirement? My name is Frank Morrison, and I spent over 3 decades as a detective with the Chicago Police Department. I thought I'd seen it all, until a mystery literally landed on my doorstep that would consume 6 months of my life and challenge everything I thought I knew about human nature. It was a crisp October morning in 2019 when I first heard the screaming. I was sitting on my porch in the quiet suburb of Elmwood Park, sipping my morning coffee and reading the Tribune, when Mrs. Henderson from across the street came running toward my house, her face pale as winter snow. What she was about to tell me would drag me out of retirement and into the most perplexing case I'd ever encountered. But before I tell you what happened that morning, you need to understand something about retirement. After spending most of your adult life chasing down leads, interrogating suspects, and solving puzzles that most people couldn't even comprehend, retirement feels like being a race car driver who's suddenly asked to drive the speed limit everywhere. Your mind is still sharp, your instincts are still there, but there's no outlet for them. That's why what happened next felt like both a curse and a blessing. Mrs. Henderson grabbed my arm with trembling hands. "Frank," she gasped, "you need to come quick. It's about the Petersons' house. Something's not right." The Peterson house had been empty for 6 months. Old couple, both died within weeks of each other, him from a heart attack, her from what I always suspected was a broken heart. Their adult children lived out of state and had been trying to sell the property, but the housing market was slow. As we hurried across the street, Mrs. Henderson explained what she'd seen. Every morning for the past week, she'd noticed lights going on and off in the Peterson house. Not random lights, but a specific pattern. Always the same sequence, always at the same time. Kitchen light at 6:47 a.m., living room light at 6:52 a.m., upstairs bedroom light at 7:03 a.m., then all lights off at 7:15 a.m. sharp. Now, you might think this sounds like a simple case of squatters or maybe kids playing pranks. But 35 years of detective work teaches you that the details matter. Mrs. Henderson had keys to the house. She'd been checking on it for the family. She'd gone inside twice during the week, and each time, everything was exactly as it should be. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone having been there, no fingerprints on the light switches, nothing disturbed. But here's where it gets interesting. The house had been without electricity for 3 months. The family had shut off all utilities to save money while trying to sell. So how were lights turning on in a house with no power? I'll admit my first instinct was to suggest Mrs. Henderson might need to get her eyes checked, but she insisted on showing me herself. So at 6:45 a.m. the next morning, I found myself crouched behind her hedges, feeling slightly ridiculous, watching an empty house like I was on a stakeout. 6:47 a.m. came and went. Nothing. I was about to suggest we call it quits when Mrs. Henderson grabbed my shoulder. "There," she whispered urgently. I looked up at the kitchen window, and I swear on my late wife's grave, I saw what looked like a warm, yellowish glow emanating from inside the house. Not the bright, harsh light of a bulb, but something softer, more diffuse. My detective brain immediately started working. Could it be reflected light from somewhere else? I looked around. No other houses had their lights on in a way that could create that effect. Could it be some kind of chemical reaction? Unlikely, but I'd seen stranger things. Could it be supernatural? Well, let's just say that after 3 decades of police work, I've learned to exhaust all logical possibilities before considering illogical ones. We watched for the full half hour. The pattern was exactly as Mrs. Henderson had described. Kitchen, living room, upstairs bedroom, then darkness. The timing was precise, almost mechanical. Whatever was causing this had a schedule, and it was sticking to it. After the lights went out, I used Mrs. Henderson's keys to get inside. The house was cold, musty, and completely dark. I had my flashlight and a voltage tester that I'd borrowed from my neighbor. I checked every electrical outlet, every light switch, every connection I could find. Nothing. The house was completely dead, electrically speaking. But I did notice something else. In the kitchen, on the counter, where the supposed light had been strongest, there was a faint warmth. Not hot, not even warm really, but just slightly above room temperature. In the living room, same thing. A patch of floor near the window that felt maybe 2 degrees warmer than the surrounding area. Now, I need to tell you about the Petersons themselves, because this detail becomes crucial later. Harold Peterson was a retired electrician who'd worked for the city for 40 years. His wife, Margaret, had been a school teacher. They'd been married for 52 years and were known in the neighborhood as creatures of habit. Harold would get up every morning at 6:45, make coffee in the kitchen, read the paper in the living room, then go upstairs to wake Margaret at 7 o'clock. She'd be dressed and ready for breakfast by 7:15. This routine had been their life for decades. Even after they both retired, even after Margaret developed early-stage dementia and didn't really need to wake up at any particular time, Harold maintained the schedule religiously. Mrs. Henderson told me that in all the years she'd known them, she could set her watch by Harold's routine. Harold had died in March, Margaret in April. The lights had started appearing in October. 6 months later, I spent the next week researching everything I could about the phenomena. I reached out to old contacts at the police department, consulted with a professor of physics at Northwestern, even spoke with a parapsychologist, though I kept that conversation brief. Everyone had theories, but no one had answers. The physicist suggested it could be some kind of phosphorescent material, possibly something Harold had worked with in his electrical career. The parapsychologist, predictably, suggested it might be residual energy from the Petersons' long-established routine. My former colleagues just looked at me like I'd lost my mind. But I kept watching. Every morning, same time, same pattern. And I started noticing other things. The house had a security system that had been disconnected, but the control panel was still visible. During the light episodes, the panel would briefly flash, not like it was receiving power, but like it was remembering power. I also noticed that the temperature variations I'd felt weren't random. They followed a path. Kitchen counter to kitchen table, to living room chair, to the base of the stairs, to the upstairs bedroom. The exact path Harold would have taken during his morning routine. 3 weeks into my investigation, I had what I can only call a breakthrough. I was talking to Harold's former supervisor at the electrical department, trying to understand what kind of materials Harold might have been exposed to during his career. The supervisor mentioned that Harold had worked extensively with tritium in the 1980s and 1990s, a radioactive isotope that glows with a greenish-yellow light. Tritium was commonly used in exit signs and watch dials. It has a half-life of about 12 years, meaning it would still be active decades after Harold's exposure. More importantly, tritium can be absorbed by the human body, and in rare cases, can be deposited in bones and tissues. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not suggesting Harold Peterson was some kind of radioactive ghost, but I started wondering if Harold's decades of exposure to tritium might have left traces in his environment, and if those traces might be activated by some kind of electromagnetic field. This led me to investigate the house's electrical history more thoroughly. I discovered that while the main power had been shut off, there was still a small electrical feed running to the house for the security system's cellular backup. This feed was so minimal that the utility company hadn't bothered to disconnect it. But here's the fascinating part. This tiny electrical current was creating a weak electromagnetic field throughout the house. Not enough to power lights, but possibly enough to excite tritium deposits left behind by Harold's 50-year presence in the house. I brought in a friend who worked with environmental cleanup to test for radioactive materials. He found trace amounts of tritium in the exact locations where I'd observed the light phenomena. The concentrations were incredibly small, well below any dangerous level, but they were there. The electromagnetic field from the security system's backup power was causing these tritium traces to fluoresce at specific times. But why the specific times? This is where Harold's electrical expertise became relevant. I found Harold's workshop in the basement, and it was like stepping into a time capsule. Shelves lined with electrical components, testing equipment, and dozens of notebooks filled with his meticulous handwriting. One notebook in particular caught my attention. It was labeled House Systems and contained detailed diagrams of every electrical circuit in the house. On the last page, dated just 2 weeks before his death, Harold had sketched out a modification to the security system. He'd figured out how to create a timer circuit that would activate specific parts of the house's electrical system using the backup power feed. The timer was set to his exact morning routine. Harold had essentially programmed his house to remember his schedule, but the modification was never installed. The sketches were there, the components were there, but the work was never done. Harold had died before he could implement his plan. So how was the house following his routine? This is where the story takes a turn that still gives me chills. I found Harold's final notebook entry, dated the day before his heart attack. He'd written, "Margaret doesn't remember our routine anymore. I'm worried about what will happen to her if I'm not here to maintain our schedule. Must find a way to keep the routine going." Harold had been trying to create a system that would maintain their daily routine, even if he wasn't there to do it himself. He'd been working on it for months, testing different approaches, trying to find a way to essentially automate his morning ritual. The tritium traces throughout the house weren't random contamination from his work. They were deliberate. Harold had been using his knowledge of tritium's properties to create a kind of luminescent map of his daily routine. The electromagnetic field from the security system was Harold's timer circuit, just implemented in a way I hadn't initially understood. But here's where it gets really interesting. I found a hidden panel in Harold's workshop that contained a complex electrical device. It was handmade, clearly Harold's work, and it was connected to the security system's backup power. The device was designed to create electromagnetic pulses at specific times: 6:47 a.m., 6:52 a.m., 7:03 a.m., and 7:15 a.m. Harold had completed his project. He'd created a system that would maintain his routine, that would keep his presence felt in the house even after he was gone. The tritium traces would glow in response to the electromagnetic pulses, creating the appearance of lights following his morning path. But why hadn't anyone found this device before? Because Harold had designed it to activate only after a specific delay. The device contained a timer that would wait 6 months after the last time Harold manually reset it before beginning its routine. Harold had reset it for the last time 2 days before his heart attack. 6 months later, the system activated, just as Harold had planned. I spent another month verifying my theory, testing the device, documenting everything. The system was incredibly sophisticated. Harold had essentially created a haunting machine, a way to ensure his presence would be felt long after he was gone. But here's the part that really got to me. Hidden in Harold's final notebook, I found a letter addressed to Margaret. In it, he explained his project. He wrote, "Maggie, I know your mind is slipping away, but I need you to know that I'll always be here. Even if you can't remember our routine, the house will remember. Every morning, I'll still get up with you, still make your coffee, still make sure you're safe. The house will know, even if we don't." Harold had died before he could explain the system to Margaret. She died a month later, never knowing about her husband's final gift to her. The house had been maintaining Harold's routine for months, but no one had been there to see it. I faced a difficult decision. The Peterson children were finally close to selling the house. Should I tell them about their father's elaborate system? Should I disable it? Should I let the new owners deal with mysterious lights? In the end, I decided to document everything and present it to the family. Harold's son flew in from California, and I showed him the entire system. I explained how his father had spent months creating this elaborate tribute to his life with Margaret, how he'd used his professional expertise to create something that was part love letter, part technological marvel. The son was amazed. He'd known his father was working on some kind of electrical project in his final months, but he'd never understood what it was. He asked me to help him preserve the system, to turn it into something the family could cherish, rather than something that would scare away potential buyers. We modified Harold's device to activate only once a year, on the anniversary of his death. We created a small memorial in the basement workshop, explaining Harold's final project. The house sold 2 months later to a young couple who were fascinated by the story and promised to maintain the memorial. I stayed in touch with the new owners. Every year on March 15th, they tell me, the house lights up with Harold's routine. They've come to see it as a blessing, a reminder that love can transcend death through the power of human ingenuity and dedication. This case taught me something profound about the nature of mystery and the power of love. Sometimes the most inexplicable phenomena have the most human explanations. Harold Peterson wasn't a ghost haunting his house. He was a man who loved his wife so much that he spent his final months creating a system to ensure his presence would comfort her even after he was gone. The mystery that brought me out of retirement wasn't about supernatural forces or unexplained phenomena. It was about a man who refused to let death interrupt his devotion to his wife. Harold had solved the ultimate problem: how to keep a promise that extends beyond the grave. As I sit here now, 4 years later, I'm reminded that the best mysteries aren't always about finding the culprit or solving the crime. Sometimes they're about discovering the lengths people will go to for love. Harold Peterson created a technological miracle not for fame or recognition, but for the simple, profound purpose of keeping his morning routine with Margaret alive. That's a case I'll never forget, and a reminder that even in retirement, there are still mysteries worth solving. The next time you see something unexplained, remember Harold Peterson. Remember that sometimes the most beautiful mysteries have the most human solutions.